"Jennifer, we need to talk about your performance," Keith said, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, fingers steepled like he was praying to the corporate gods. I knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. The conference room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in as my colleagues, people I'd worked alongside for 3 years, stared down at the polished oak table. "The team feels your approach isn't aligned with our culture anymore." I looked at Melissa, who'd been my lunch buddy since day one. She was examining her manicure. At Dave, who'd called me at midnight last month when he couldn't figure out how to fix the client presentation I'd built the framework for. He was suddenly fascinated by his water bottle. "This will be better for everyone," Lauren chimed in, not quite meeting my eyes. Lauren, who I'd covered for countless times when she needed to pick up her kids early. "The team dynamic just isn't working." Keith slid a manila folder across the table. "We've prepared a severance package. 2 weeks' pay. We'll need your badge and laptop before you leave today. 2 weeks. For 3 years of late nights, missed weekends, and solved problems. For the Carlson account I'd landed single-handedly. For the reporting system I'd redesigned that saved them thousands. For the client crisis I'd managed when Keith was unreachable during his Cabo vacation." "I understand," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. What I understood was that Pearson Media Partners was cutting costs before their merger, and I was expendable. What I understood was that Keith had been taking credit for my ideas for months. What I understood was that nobody in this room was going to stand up for me. Keith nodded, already checking his watch. The meeting was over. My career at Pearson was over. Just like that. I packed my desk into a cardboard box while my now former colleagues awkwardly shuffled past, mumbling empty promises to stay in touch and grab coffee sometime. Mark from accounting couldn't even look at me, though he'd just thanked me last week for helping with his daughter's college applications. Tara from design gave me a quick side hug before darting away, as if unemployment might be contagious. When Melissa finally approached, her expression a mixture of guilt and relief, I just smiled. "Hey, this will be better for everyone, right?" I said, echoing Lauren's words as I placed my security badge on Keith's empty desk. The family photo I'd kept there, my parents, my sister, and me at Lake Winnipesaukee last summer, went into the box last. I didn't look back as the glass doors of Pearson Media Partners closed behind me. The security guard in the lobby, Edwin, gave me a sympathetic nod as I passed. At least someone had the decency to acknowledge what was happening. "You're worth more than this place anyway, Miss Carter," he said quietly, holding the door for me. I nodded, afraid that if I spoke, the tears I was holding back might break through. The April rain hit me as I stepped outside, immediately soaking through my thin blazer. Perfect. Even the weather was against me today. That night, curled up on my couch with a glass of wine I couldn't really afford anymore, I scrolled through job listings until my eyes burned. My apartment in Medford felt too quiet, too empty. The rain tapped against my windows like it was asking to be let in. My phone lit up with a text from Dave. "So sorry about today. Keith made the call. Nothing we could do." I didn't respond. There was always something they could have done. They just chose not to. The same Dave who'd stood up to Keith last year when he tried to reduce holiday bonuses had suddenly lost his backbone when it was my job on the line. Another text, this time from Melissa. "Drinks this weekend? I feel terrible about everything." I put my phone face down on the coffee table. The pity drinks could wait. Right now, I needed a plan. The wine wasn't helping. I put down my glass and opened my laptop instead. If I was starting over, I might as well do it right. First, I updated my resume. Then, I made a list of every contact I'd cultivated at Pearson that wasn't in that conference room today. Clients who'd specifically requested to work with me. Vendors who'd given us better rates because I'd built those relationships. The network I'd created that Pearson was about to inherit without me. By midnight, I had emails drafted to each of them. Not burning bridges, I was smarter than that, but letting them know I was moving on to new opportunities and would love to stay connected. I scheduled them to send at 9 a.m. when everyone would be checking their morning emails. Then I opened a new document and started typing out everything I knew about Pearson's processes. The shortcuts I'd discovered. The inefficiencies I'd worked around but never had the authority to fix. The innovations I'd suggested that Keith had dismissed before presenting variations of them as his own months later. This wasn't about revenge. This was about survival. And maybe, just maybe, about building something better than what I was leaving behind. I fell asleep on the couch, laptop still open, sometime around 3 a.m. My dreams were a jumble of conference rooms and falling rain, and doors closing in my face. 6 months later, I was working at Richmond Digital, a smaller firm across town. The pay was worse, the title was lower, but I had my foot in the door. I kept my head down, worked twice as hard as anyone else, and waited. I'd given myself 1 year to learn everything I could about how Richmond operated, both what worked and what didn't. My new boss, Terry, was nothing like Keith. She actually listened to ideas, gave credit where it was due, and fought for her team when upper management made unreasonable demands. It was refreshing, but also a painful reminder of what I'd put up with for too long at Pearson. "You don't have to kill yourself every day," Terry told me once, finding me still at my desk at 8 p.m. "We appreciate the effort, but burnout is real." I nodded but kept working. She didn't understand that this wasn't just about impressing Richmond. This was about what came next. I also started a side hustle, building websites and managing social media for small businesses in my spare time. My first client was a local bakery whose owner I'd met at a networking event. Then came a florist, then a boutique gym. Small jobs, but they added up, and more importantly, they built my portfolio. I followed the news about Pearson. The merger went through, but the promised synergies didn't materialize. Reading between the lines of industry newsletters, I could tell they were struggling. A former colleague who'd left shortly after me confirmed my suspicions over coffee. "Keith's running the place into the ground," she said. "The good people are jumping ship. The Carlson account is on the verge of walking." I sipped my latte, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and sadness. And the team that stayed? Miserable. Lauren got promoted to Keith's second-in-command, if you can believe it. Birds of a feather, I guess. I nodded, filing the information away. Not because I wanted revenge, but because knowledge was power in our industry. A year passed. My role at Richmond expanded. My side business grew steadily. I moved to a slightly better apartment in Somerville, one with a small balcony where I could have my morning coffee and actually see a patch of sky between buildings. Then came the email that changed everything. Joanne Chen, a former client from Pearson who'd always appreciated my work, reached out. She'd started her own consulting firm and needed help with a major project. "I remembered how you solved that impossible timeline issue for us," she wrote. "My team is drowning, and I need someone who can actually deliver." The project paid well enough that when it ended 3 months later, I had enough savings to make a decision. I quit Richmond Digital and officially launched Meridian Strategies, my own consulting firm. Terry took me to lunch on my last day. "I'm not surprised," she said. "You were always meant for bigger things than being someone else's employee." I learned a lot here, I told her, and meant it. Especially about what good leadership looks like. She smiled. "Just promise me one thing. When you're building your team, remember what it felt like to be undervalued. Don't become a Keith." I nodded, thinking about the business plan I'd spent months refining. That's exactly what I'm trying to avoid. The early days of running my own business were terrifying. Some weeks I barely slept. Other weeks I wondered if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. My savings dwindled faster than expected. Potential clients wanted to see a track record I was still building. Every decision, from the company name to the logo to the service packages, felt like it might make or break my future. But Joanne referred me to other clients. My website portfolio spoke for itself. And I was good at what I did, better than I'd been allowed to be at Pearson. I understood the market in ways my competitors didn't, because I'd spent years studying it while others were coasting. One night, after landing a contract that would keep me afloat for the next 3 months, I celebrated by splurging on takeout from the expensive Thai place down the street. As I sat on my balcony, watching the sunset turn the Somerville rooftops golden, I realized I hadn't thought about Keith or that conference room in weeks. The memory still stung, but it no longer defined me. That day had closed a door, but I'd found a window, one with a much better view. 2 years after being fired, Meridian Strategies had 6 employees. We moved into a real office space. Nothing fancy, just a converted textile mill in Lowell with exposed brick walls and large windows. But it was mine. The conference room table I chose was round, not rectangular like Pearson's. Nobody sat at the head because there wasn't one. I hired carefully, looking not just for skills but for character. People who would speak up, who wouldn't abandon each other when things got difficult. We developed a reputation for solving the problems other agencies couldn't crack. Luke, my operations manager, had been passed over repeatedly at his previous firm despite his obvious talents. Amir, my creative director, had been told his ideas were too innovative for the conservative clients at his last job. Sarah, my first account executive, had been on the verge of leaving the industry entirely after a toxic workplace experience similar to mine. I was ready to go back to school and become a veterinarian, she told me during her interview. But your company values actually sound like something I could believe in. They're not just words on our website, I assured her. They're lessons I learned the hard way. I rarely thought about Pearson anymore. Occasionally, I'd see their campaigns and notice the declining quality, the missed opportunities, the recycled ideas. But I was too busy building something better to dwell on the past. Until the day Luke dropped a name that made me freeze. I just got off the phone with Westlake Media, he said during our Monday morning meeting. They're acquiring Pearson Media Partners and want help with the transition. My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. Pearson? Really? Luke nodded, flipping through his notes. Apparently, there's been a mass exodus of talent. They've lost major accounts. Westlake is basically buying their client list and a few remaining assets. What happened? Asked Amir, reaching for a croissant from the box in the center of our round table. Bad management, from what the Westlake VP told me. Some guy named Keith drove the place into the ground trying to look good for the previous merger. Overpromised, underdelivered, alienated both clients and staff. I shouldn't have smiled. It wasn't professional. But for just a moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the karmic justice. Keith had sacrificed his team for his ambitions, and in the end, he'd lost everything anyway. Do we want the account? I asked, composing myself. It could be complicated. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Because you used to work there? I nodded. I'd been transparent with my team about my professional history. Luke shrugged. It's potentially our biggest client yet. They want to meet the team before deciding. But if it feels too personal. I thought about it for a moment. Taking this job wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about business. About growing Meridian. About proving we could handle complex transitions. Set it up, I said finally. If they choose us, we'll approach it like any other project, professionally and strategically. Amir grinned. And if you happen to run into some former colleagues along the way? I shook my head, but couldn't entirely suppress my own smile. Then I'll be the consummate professional they never were. The Westlake executives were impressed with our presentation. We signed the contract a week later, a 1-year agreement to help restructure what remained of Pearson and integrate it into Westlake's operations. We'll need to interview the remaining Pearson staff, I told the Westlake CEO, Martin Reeves. Evaluate who to keep, who to reassign. He nodded. That's your call. We trust your judgment. The first interviews were scheduled for the following Monday. I reviewed the personnel files over the weekend, sitting on my balcony overlooking the Mystic River. Most of the names I didn't recognize, newer hires who'd joined after my departure. But there were some familiar ones too. Keith had apparently left 6 months ago for a better opportunity, according to his exit interview, though industry gossip suggested he'd been forced out. Lauren was still there.
So was Dave.
And Melissa. I considered recusing myself from their interviews, letting Luke handle them instead. That would have been the bigger person move. But I didn't build Meridian by being the bigger person. I built it by being the better strategist. Monday morning, I dressed carefully. A charcoal suit that cost more than my entire wardrobe at Pearson. Hair pulled back, minimal jewelry, subtle makeup. Professional, polished, powerful. We set up in Pearson's old conference room, the same one where I'd been fired 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. My team arranged the presentation materials while I reviewed my notes one last time. Nervous? Luke asked quietly, setting up his laptop. I shook my head. Just focus. The truth was more complicated. I'd imagined this moment many times over the years, coming back to Pearson successful, proving them wrong. But now that it was happening, I felt strangely calm. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about the next chapter for Meridian. At 9:30, the door opened and Lauren walked in. She'd cut her hair short and added some gray since I'd last seen her. Her eyes widened as she recognized me, her steps faltering. Jennifer, she said, the name catching in her throat. Miss Carter now. I corrected her gently. Please take a seat. She sank into the chair opposite me, clutching her portfolio like a shield. Luke gave her a professional smile and began explaining the purpose of the interview. We're evaluating all current staff for potential roles within the new structure, he said. Your experience and skills will determine your placement if there is one. Lauren's eyes never left my face. I didn't know you'd be involved in this. Life is full of surprises, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Now, tell me about your current responsibilities and achievements over the last 3 years. She stumbled through her answers, contradicting herself several times. When Luke asked about her biggest professional challenge, she mentioned maintaining team cohesion during difficult transitions. And how did you handle those transitions? I asked, thinking of her words that day. This will be better for everyone. I tried to make decisions that were best for everyone involved. I nodded, writing something on my notepad. I see. After 20 excruciating minutes, we thanked her for her time. As she stood to leave, visibly relieved, I added, we'll be making decisions by the end of the week. Dave was next. He'd gained weight, and the confidence he'd once projected had dimmed considerably. He recognized me immediately. Jenny. Wow, this is unexpected. He attempted a familiar smile. It's been ages. How have you been? It's Jennifer. I corrected him again. And I'm conducting an interview, not catching up with old friends. His face fell. Right, of course. Professional. Got it. Dave tried harder than Lauren, emphasizing projects he'd managed and ideas he'd supposedly developed. I let him talk, noting how many of those ideas had originated with me years ago. It says here you've been passed over for promotion twice, Luke observed, reviewing his file. Dave shifted uncomfortably. Politics, he muttered. Keith played favorites. Interesting, I said. And how did you respond to that unfair treatment? He blinked. I kept my head down, focused on my work. Rather than standing up for yourself or others, I noted, not looking up from my papers. Thank you for your time, Dave. The morning continued. Other former colleagues, some who barely remembered me, others who clearly did but pretended otherwise. Each interview followed the same pattern: professional questions, uncomfortable recognition, awkward attempts to establish familiarity I didn't acknowledge. After lunch, Melissa walked in. Of everyone from that day, her silence had hurt the most. We'd shared secrets, celebrated birthdays, helped each other through breakups. She'd been a bridesmaid at my sister's wedding, and she'd stared at her hands while Keith fired me. Jennifer, she said quietly, no pretense of surprise. She'd clearly heard about the morning interviews. Melissa, I replied. Please sit. Unlike the others, she didn't try to impress me or pretend we were friends. She answered questions honestly, admitted mistakes, outlined her actual contributions. As the interview concluded, she finally said what no one else had. I should have said something that day, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper. I was a coward, and I've regretted it ever since. When I saw how Keith treated everyone after you left, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. For a moment, I felt the hard shell I'd built crack slightly. But business wasn't about feelings. Thank you for your candor, I said. We'll be in touch. That evening, my team and I reviewed the interviews at Meridian's office. We'd taken over the conference room, spreading files across the table, profiles of each employee projected on the wall. So, what's the verdict? Luke asked, leaning back in his chair. Who stays, who goes? I studied the notes we'd compiled. We need to be strategic. This isn't about the past. It's about building the strongest possible team for Westlake. Amir raised an eyebrow. But you're the boss. If you want a clean house. I shook my head. That's not how I operate. That's what Keith would do. Make decisions based on personal feelings rather than what's best for the business. We recommend keeping the people with actual skills and potential, regardless of our history. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's why we all work here instead of somewhere else. We worked late into the night, evaluating each candidate objectively. When we finished, our recommendations included retaining about 40% of the current staff, reassigning 30% to different positions at Westlake, and letting the rest go. Lauren was in the last category. Her management style had created more problems than solutions, and her actual contributions were minimal. Dave was recommended for demotion and retraining. He had technical skills but needed supervision. And Melissa. She's actually good at what she does, Luke noted. The client testimonials back it up. I nodded. Put her on the retain list. But not in her current role. I have something else in mind. Friday morning, we presented our recommendations to Martin Reeves. He approved them without changes. You know what you're doing, he said. I trust your judgment. The announcements would be made Monday. I spent the weekend finalizing the details, preparing for the transition. On Sunday night, I stood on my balcony, watching the lights of Boston across the river. 3 years ago, I'd been devastated, humiliated, lost. Now I was about to determine the fates of the people who'd allowed it to happen. But this wasn't about revenge. It had never been about revenge. It was about building something better than what they'd destroyed. Monday morning, I arrived early. The Pearson conference room had been set up for a full staff meeting. As people filtered in, the tension was palpable. Everyone knew decisions had been made. No one knew what they were. I recognized the expressions, the same mixture of fear and hope I'd felt before countless meetings with Keith. The difference was that my decisions were based on merit, not politics. Martin Reeves opened the meeting, introducing me and my team as the architects of the transition. Then he turned the floor over to me. I stood at the front of the room, the same spot where Keith had stood 3 years ago. Change is never easy, I began. But sometimes it's necessary. Today marks the end of Pearson Media Partners and the beginning of your integration with Westlake. For some of you, this means new opportunities. For others, it means it's time to move on. Murmurs rippled through the room. I continued, outlining the transition process, the timeline, the expectations. Then I got to the part they were all waiting for. Each of you will receive an individual email within the hour detailing your specific situation. Those who are being let go will have meetings with HR this afternoon to discuss severance packages, which, I should note, are considerably more generous than Pearson's previous standards. My eyes found Lauren in the crowd. She was staring at her hands, just as she had that day. I want to be clear about something, I added. These decisions weren't made lightly, and they weren't made based on personal history. They were made based on performance, potential, and the needs of the organization moving forward. I paused, looking around the room. In other words, this will be better for everyone. The meeting concluded. People shuffled out, immediately checking their phones for the promised emails. I returned to the temporary office we'd set up, where Luke was coordinating the HR meetings and Amir was preparing orientation materials for those staying on. At 2 p.m., there was a knock on my door. Melissa stood there holding her laptop. I got my email, she said. Senior Account Manager at Meridian Strategies, reporting directly to you. Is that right? I gestured for her to come in and close the door. It is, I confirmed. You have the skills we need. And unlike some others, you had the integrity to acknowledge your mistake. She sat down slowly. Why would you want to work with me after what happened? I studied her for a moment. Because business isn't about feelings. It's about building the best team possible. And because everyone deserves a second chance, if they've earned it. And the others? Lauren is being let go. Dave is being demoted and reassigned to Westlake's production department. They'll have opportunities to prove themselves, just like you will. Melissa nodded, absorbing this. I won't waste this chance, she said finally. I know you won't, I replied. Because unlike Pearson, at Meridian, We actually value loyalty and stand up for each other. I expect you to do the same." After she left, I stood by the window, looking out at the Boston skyline. The satisfaction I felt wasn't about seeing former colleagues squirm or making them pay. It was about creating something stronger than what had broken me, and knowing that some of them would be part of it, while others wouldn't.